The wind cut like a blade, tearing through Hannah Carter's threadbare dress as she staggered down the frozen dirt road, her children clutching either side of her skirt. Eli, her 8-year-old, tried to be strong, his small jaw clenched, but his trembling fingers betrayed him. Clara, just 7, had long since stopped crying. Her tiny face, framed by golden curls, was ghostly pale. The girl's lips, once soft and pink, were now cracked and blue. Behind them, the dark silhouette of the farmhouse loomed, the place she had called home since her marriage to William. Now it was nothing but a tomb filled with the cold, sneering faces of her husband's kin, people who had once embraced her, once claimed to be her family. The moment William had drawn his last breath, they had turned, their pity souring into contempt. She had no claim to their roof, they said, no claim to the food or the warmth of their fire. A widow was nothing but a burden, and 2 starving mouths only made it worse. The barn door slammed behind them, the echo ringing through the barren landscape. Snow churned beneath their feet as Hannah trudged forward, her boots barely holding together. She didn't know where they were going. She only knew they had to keep moving. The sky was a bruised shade of gray, heavy with the promise of another storm. Trees lined the narrow path ahead, their skeletal branches swaying like the fingers of some unseen specter. Hannah clutched Clara to her chest as the wind howled. Every step forward felt like a battle against the earth itself, as if the land had conspired with her in-laws to swallow her whole. Eli walked beside her in silence. His cheeks were raw from the wind, his knuckles red from clenching them so tightly. He had not spoken since they were cast out, not even when his aunt had torn the blanket from his shoulders before slamming the door in his face. "I can carry her," Eli said suddenly, his voice hoarse. "You're tired." Hannah's heart clenched. He was only a boy, a child who should have been playing near the hearth, not offering to carry his sister through a wilderness that wanted them dead. She gave him a weak smile, shaking her head. "I'm all right, love. Just keep close." The road twisted, disappearing into the trees. The deeper they went, the quieter the world became. Only the crunch of ice beneath their feet and the rasp of their breath remained. By midday, their bodies ached, their stomachs churned with hunger. Hannah tried to focus on anything other than the gnawing emptiness clawing at her insides. But it was relentless. The last meal they had eaten was 2 days ago, a crust of bread given to them out of pity before the door had slammed shut. Clara whimpered. Hannah pressed her lips to the child's forehead. "Too cold, too weak. Not much farther," she whispered, though she had no idea if that was true. Eli tripped, catching himself before he hit the ground. He gritted his teeth, swiping at his face in frustration. Hannah swallowed the lump in her throat. "We'll stop soon. Find some shelter." But where? The land stretched endlessly before them, blanketed in white. The trees, though tall, offered no refuge against the cold that gnawed at their bones. A crow cawed in the distance. Eli tugged on her sleeve. "There." She followed his gaze. A small structure stood just beyond the ridge, half hidden by the trees. A trading post. Hope flared in her chest. With renewed urgency, they stumbled toward the abandoned building. The wood was warped from age, the door barely clinging to its rusted hinges. Hannah braced herself, then shoved against it with her shoulder. It groaned in protest before giving way. Inside, the air was stale, thick with dust and decay. Shelves lined the walls, mostly bare, though a few broken crates lay scattered across the floor. A fireplace stood in the corner, long dead but still intact. She set Clara down gently, wrapping what little fabric she had around the girl. Eli was already rummaging through the debris. "Anything?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not much," he admitted, holding up a cracked bottle. "Some dried-up beans. Nothing fresh." Hannah nodded. It would have to do. She turned her attention to the fireplace. If she could get a fire going, they might survive the night. She reached for the flint she had taken from the farmhouse, her hands stiff from the cold. The first strike sparked, but the kindling was damp. She tried again, and again. A spark caught. A small ember flickered, then died. Desperation gnawed at her. She struck the flint again, harder this time. The ember grew. Smoke curled upward. A flame. She exhaled shakily, shielding the fragile fire with her hands as it licked at the wood. Slowly, warmth began to seep into the space. Clara stirred, pressing closer to the flickering light. Eli sat beside her, pulling his knees to his chest. For the first time in hours, Hannah allowed herself to breathe. Outside, the wind howled. The walls creaked under its weight. Something moved in the darkness. Hannah froze. A low growl. Her pulse thundered. Eli stiffened beside her. The growl came again, closer this time. She reached for the rusted knife she had found earlier, gripping it tightly. Her body screamed at her to run, but there was nowhere to go. Nowhere safe. The door, still partially ajar, shuddered against the wind. A shadow passed by the opening. Not human. A wolf. Hannah pressed a hand over Clara's mouth as she stirred. Eli's breath was shallow, his wide eyes locked on the doorway. The wolf sniffed the air. Another gust of wind rattled the building, and the creature stepped forward. Hannah's grip tightened on the knife. If it came closer, if it lunged, she would fight. The wolf let out a low, rumbling snarl, eyes gleaming in the firelight. Its fur was thick, dusted with frost. It took another step. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it turned and slunk back into the night. Silence. Hannah exhaled shakily, her hands trembling. Eli swallowed hard. "Do you think it'll come back?" "I don't know," she admitted. They didn't sleep that night. The fire burned low, casting flickering shadows on the walls. The wind never stopped, and Hannah knew, deep in her bones, that this was only the beginning. Dawn broke over the horizon, painting the sky in muted golds and purples. As she stared at the rising sun, exhaustion pressing heavy on her shoulders, a shadow fell across the doorway. Tall, silent, a figure stood there, watching them. Her breath caught. Not a wolf, not a bandit, something else. The stranger did not move, did not speak. But Hannah knew, without a doubt, everything was about to change. The man stood motionless in the doorway, his face shadowed beneath the low morning light. Hannah tensed, her heart hammering against her ribs as she clutched Clara tighter. Eli pressed against her side, his breath shallow, his fingers curling into the fabric of her dress. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his form wrapped in thick furs that carried the scent of earth and smoke. His long, dark hair was braided, resting against his chest, and his eyes, sharp, unyielding, studied them with quiet intensity. A bough was slung over his back, a knife strapped to his hip. He did not speak. Hannah's grip on the rusted knife tightened, though she knew it was a feeble defense against a man like this. The fire had burned low, flickering weakly between them, casting shadows that danced across his expressionless face. He could kill them if he wanted to. There would be no struggle worth mentioning, no chance to run. The silence stretched. Then, slowly, he reached into the folds of his furs and pulled something free. A small bundle. He took one step forward, placed it on the ground, and stepped back. Hannah hesitated, her body coiled with tension. The bundle lay there between them, wrapped in rough cloth. Eli shifted, his voice barely above a whisper. "What is it?" She didn't answer. She forced herself to move, inching forward, never taking her eyes off the man. Her fingers trembled as she reached out, peeling the cloth back. Dried meat, a flask of water, a gift. She swallowed hard, lifting her gaze. He was still watching, unmoving, unreadable. She expected a demand, some price to be named, a trade, an order, a warning. None came. She did not trust kindness. She had learned that kindness always came with a cost, that it was something people wielded like a tool, like a weapon, only to snatch it back when it suited them. But there was no cruelty in his gaze, no amusement, no malice, only quiet expectation. She exhaled slowly. "Thank you." He gave no sign that he had heard her. Instead, he turned, stepping back toward the door, as if satisfied with whatever unspoken decision had passed between them. "Wait," she blurted, surprising even herself. He paused, glancing back over his shoulder. Hannah hesitated. Her throat felt dry. The words lodged there, unwilling to form. She wanted to ask why. Why he had helped her. Why he had left them this offering instead of walking away. Instead, She found herself gripping the food tighter, as if it might disappear the moment he vanished. The man did not press her for words. He only nodded once before slipping back into the morning mist. She did not see him again for 2 days. The food lasted longer than expected, divided carefully between them. Clara grew stronger, her cheeks less hollow. Eli ate quietly, his gaze flicking toward the door every so often, waiting. Hannah told herself not to hope. The second time he appeared, she did not flinch. This time, he entered without hesitation, stepping inside as if he had already decided they were not a threat. The wind howled behind him, carrying the bitter sting of approaching snowfall. Hannah straightened, willing her voice not to waver. "Who are you?" He glanced at her, then at the fire, as if considering whether or not to answer. Finally, his voice broke the silence, rough-edged and low. "Cheyenne." The name hung between them, unfamiliar yet solid. He crouched by the fire, holding his hands to the warmth, his movements slow, deliberate. Eli watched him with wary curiosity, his fingers tightening around his knees. Cheyenne's gaze drifted toward the boy. "You are strong." Eli blinked. The words, though simple, carried weight. Recognition. He sat a little straighter, nodding hesitantly. Hannah frowned. "Why are you helping us?" Cheyenne did not answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his satchel, pulling free a bundle of animal skins. Without a word, he handed them to her. Hannah hesitated, then took them. They were soft, thick, warm. She swallowed. "You're giving us this? You need it." Simple, certain, no expectation of repayment. She gripped the furs, feeling the heat of them against her frozen fingers. "I don't understand. You don't even know us." Cheyenne's gaze flickered toward the fire. "I know hunger." The words settled heavily between them. She studied him more closely then, the quiet way he held himself, the way he did not waste unnecessary movement, the sharp awareness in his eyes. A man who had seen more than he cared to speak of. Silence fell once more, but it was different now, less suffocating. When Cheyenne finally stood, adjusting the strap of his satchel, Hannah found herself speaking before she could think. "Where are you going?" He met her gaze, his expression as unreadable as ever. "Hunting." She hesitated. "Will you come back?" A beat of quiet passed. Then he nodded once. Eli, for the first time in days, smiled. Cheyenne returned the next evening, carrying the spoils of his hunt, a rabbit, skinned and gutted, its meat fresh. He wordlessly handed it to Hannah, watching as she blinked in stunned silence. That night, they ate well. Days passed. The snowfall thickened, blanketing the land in endless white. Cheyenne did not leave. At first, he came only in the evenings, his presence a quiet force in their makeshift home. But as the winter deepened, as the cold became relentless, he stayed longer. He spoke little, but his actions spoke for him. He showed Eli how to weave traps, how to set them with patience and precision. He brought firewood, stacking it against the far wall. One evening, as Hannah struggled to sew a torn piece of cloth with numb fingers, Cheyenne took the needle from her hands and finished the work himself. She did not know what to make of him. The fear she had clung to, the distrust that had once burned so fiercely in her chest, was fading, replaced by something she could not yet name. Clara had taken to him quickly. She would sit beside him, watching with wide, curious eyes as he sharpened his knife. He let her, never speaking, never pushing her away. Eli followed him with quiet reverence, mimicking his movements, eager to learn. And Hannah, for the first time in what felt like years, was not afraid. The fire crackled between them, casting long shadows on the wooden walls. Cheyenne shifted, glancing at her from across the flames. "Winter will not be kind." She nodded. "It never is." His gaze held hers. "You cannot stay here." She swallowed. "I have nowhere else to go." A pause. "Come with me." The words sent a jolt through her. She stared at him, searching his expression for something, anything, that might hint at deception. But there was nothing, only quiet certainty. "You don't even know me," she whispered. "I know enough." She looked at her children. Clara, curled up against the furs, her breathing soft and even. Eli, sitting beside Chayton, his hands calloused, his eyes older than they should be. A choice. She exhaled slowly, her grip tightening around the fabric in her lap. The wind howled outside. The fire burned low. And Hannah, for the first time since the world had turned against her, felt something stir deep within her chest. Hope. The journey away from the abandoned trading post was slow, each step pressing them deeper into the wilderness, farther from the world they had known. Snow crunched underfoot, the weight of it heavy on Hannah's boots. Eli walked close to Chayton, mirroring his careful movements, while Clara rode against the warrior's back, her small hands clinging to the thick furs draped over his shoulders. Hannah kept her distance. She watched him as they walked, trying to decipher the quiet strength in his stride, the way he barely made a sound despite his size. His presence unsettled her in ways she could not name. He had given her no reason to fear him, and yet fear had been her companion for so long that it refused to release its grip on her so easily. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. The trees grew denser, their towering forms blocking out the gray sky. The deeper they went, the more Hannah realized how lost she would have been without Chayton's guidance. There were no roads here, no markers, only endless white and the whispering voice of the forest. By nightfall, they made camp near a rocky overhang, where the wind was less cruel. Chayton worked efficiently, gathering wood, striking flint against steel until embers caught. Hannah pulled the furs tighter around Clara, watching the way Eli leaned in as Chayton showed him how to stack the wood properly, how to feed the fire slowly so it burned steady and strong. She wanted to speak, to thank him, but the words felt foreign on her tongue. Instead, she busied herself with preparing what little food they had. The dried meat he had given them days before was nearly gone, but Chayton had brought fresh game, skinned and cleaned with careful precision. As the scent of roasting meat filled the air, Hannah felt the first pang of something unfamiliar, relief. Clara had warmed up to him faster than Hannah expected. She sat beside him, her small hands playing with the fringe of his coat, tracing the beads sewn into the leather. He let her, unbothered by her quiet curiosity. When she shivered, he wrapped the edge of his cloak around her without a word. Eli was different. He wanted to learn, to prove himself. He studied Chayton's every move, from the way he tied knots to how he cut the meat. He did not ask questions, only observed. Hannah found herself watching too. As night settled in, the firelight cast long shadows against the trees. Chayton sat across from her, sharpening his knife with slow, practiced movements. His expression remained unreadable, but there was a stillness about him, a patience she had never seen in a man before. "Where are we going?" she finally asked. Chayton did not pause in his work. "My winter camp." She swallowed. "How far?" 2 days. The thought of traveling through the snow for 2 more days made her stomach twist, but she forced herself to nod. Clara had already drifted asleep, curled beneath the blankets, while Eli sat up beside the fire, eyes heavy with exhaustion. Hannah reached out, brushing the hair from his forehead. "Sleep," she murmured. He shook his head stubbornly. "I'm not tired." Chayton glanced at him. "Rest is strength." Eli hesitated before nodding, stretching out beside Clara. Hannah waited until his breathing slowed before allowing herself to exhale. The night was quiet, save for the occasional crackle of the fire and the distant call of an owl. Hannah felt the weight of Chayton's gaze on her, steady and unwavering. "You do not trust me," he said finally. She stiffened. "I don't trust anyone." His eyes flickered with something unreadable. "Wise." She frowned. "Then why help us?" He was silent for a long moment, as if deciding whether or not to answer. Finally, he sheathed his knife and leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. "You are alone," he said simply. "I have seen what happens to those left to fend for themselves." She swallowed, her fingers curling into the blanket draped over her lap. "And what do you expect in return?" His expression did not change. Nothing. She wanted to believe him. But life had taught her that men never gave without expecting something in return. They sat in silence, the fire burning between them. The next day, the journey continued, the terrain growing harsher. Hannah's legs ached, her breath forming small clouds in the icy air. Cheyenne moved ahead of them, clearing the path, his presence a silent promise of safety. They reached a river by midday, its surface half frozen, jagged ice breaking apart where the current ran strong. Cheyenne studied it for a moment before stepping onto the ice, testing its strength. Hannah's heart pounded. "Is it safe?" He nodded. "Step where I step." She hesitated, then took Eli's hand. The ice creaked beneath them as they moved forward. Clara whimpered, burying her face in Hannah's shoulder. The river below roared, dark and merciless. Hannah forced herself to keep going, following in Cheyenne's exact footsteps. A crack split the air. Her stomach lurched. Eli gasped as the ice beneath his foot gave way. Hannah lunged, grabbing his arm just as Cheyenne moved, swift as a striking hawk. His hand clamped around Eli's wrist, pulling him back onto solid ground before the ice could swallow him whole. Eli trembled, his breath coming in short, panicked bursts. Cheyenne crouched before him, gripping his shoulders. "Breathe," he said, his voice calm, steady. "You are safe." Eli swallowed hard, nodding. Hannah's hand shook as she pulled him close. She met Cheyenne's gaze over Eli's head, her chest tight. "Thank you," she whispered. They crossed the rest of the river carefully, reaching the far side without further incident. By the time they arrived at Cheyenne's winter camp, exhaustion weighed heavy on Hannah's bones. The camp was nestled between towering rock formations, shielded from the wind. A small fire pit sat in the center, surrounded by simple but sturdy shelters made of wood and hide. Cheyenne moved with quiet efficiency, setting down his pack, checking their surroundings. Eli sat beside the fire, staring into the flames, while Clara curled up beside him, her body finally giving in to fatigue. Hannah hesitated before lowering herself onto the furs Cheyenne had spread out for them. "You are safe here," he said. She met his gaze, searching for deception and finding none. For the first time in months, she believed it. That night, as the fire burned low and the wind howled beyond the rocky cliffs, Hannah allowed herself to close her eyes. She did not dream of hunger. She did not dream of fear. She dreamed only of warmth. The days passed, each one blending into the next as winter tightened its grip on the land. Cheyenne's camp became a refuge for Hannah and her children, a place of quiet survival. The nights were long and cold, but they were safe, and that safety, though fragile, was a comfort she had not dared to hope for in the darkest moments. She watched her children grow stronger each day. Eli, though still quiet, was more confident, his curiosity now tempered with a newfound understanding of the world around him. Clara, too, began to laugh again, the sound soft but real. Cheyenne moved through the days with a quiet presence, as constant as the mountains surrounding them. He hunted when food ran low, building traps and tracking animals with a skill that amazed Hannah. His movements were always deliberate, his attention unwavering, as if the world existed in those moments of stillness and focus. And though he said little, she found herself watching him more and more, trying to understand him the way he had understood her. She noticed the way he cared for her children, small things, like the way he always made sure Clara was warm before he turned his own work, or how he would teach Eli to carve wood when he thought no one was looking. And there were the moments when their eyes met across the fire, when something unspoken passed between them, something she didn't know how to name, something she didn't know if she was ready to acknowledge. But with every passing day, the weight of her grief began to lift, replaced by something gentler, something quieter. A peace she hadn't thought possible, not after the life she had lived, not after the loss that still haunted her. She didn't know if it was his presence, or the land itself, that had begun to heal her. Maybe it was both. But for the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to believe in the possibility of a future that wasn't defined by loss. One evening, as the wind howled outside the shelter, Cheyenne spoke to her for the first time about the past. It was late, the fire crackling low in the pit between them, and Clara had already fallen asleep, her head resting against Eli's side. Eli, too, was nearly asleep, his fingers still wrapped around the carving he had been working on, a small figure of a bear, clumsy but endearing. "You have lost much," Cheyenne said, his voice low but steady, as though he had been carrying the weight of his own story for a long time. Hannah shifted uncomfortably but didn't look away from the fire. She had grown used to the silence between them, but there was something in his tone tonight that made her feel vulnerable, exposed. "I have," she said quietly, her throat tight. She hadn't spoken of her husband's death since the day it happened. The wound was still raw, still too fresh to touch. But Cheyenne had seen her grief, and in a way, he understood it without her needing to say a word. "Loss is a hard thing," he said. "I know." Hannah nodded, unsure how to respond, but the truth of his words resonated with her. She turned her gaze to him, meeting his eyes for the first time in a long while. There was a depth to his gaze, an understanding that came from experience, from a life lived in the shadows of loss and survival. "I thought I would never find peace again," she said softly. I thought the pain would never stop." Cheyenne was quiet for a long time, his eyes never leaving hers. Then, slowly, he reached out, his hand brushing the back of hers, a small, simple gesture, but one that made her heart race. It was the first time he had touched her in such a way, and it felt like the world shifted in that moment, just slightly, but enough to leave her breathless. "You will," he said, his voice gentle, "in time. But you must trust yourself, and you must trust others too." She swallowed hard, the weight of his words settling in her chest. Trust. She had spent so long building walls around herself, locking everyone out, convinced that to trust was to be vulnerable, to be hurt again. But here, in this quiet corner of the world, with this man who had no reason to protect her, she felt something stir, something raw and real. "I don't know if I can trust again," she confessed, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know if I'm strong enough." Cheyenne's fingers lingered on hers for a moment longer, then he slowly withdrew his hand, as though sensing her hesitation. "You are," he said simply, the conviction in his words undeniable. "Strength comes in many forms. It's not always about fighting or surviving. It's about letting go. It's about opening your heart again, even when it feels like it will break." Hannah closed her eyes, his words washing over her like a quiet tide. For so long, she had held on to her grief, her anger, her fear, thinking they were the only things that would keep her safe. But Cheyenne was right. Strength wasn't just about holding on. It was about knowing when to let go, when to trust again. The fire flickered between them, the heat warm against her skin, but it was the warmth between them that she felt most acutely. She had been so afraid of the world, so afraid of what could happen if she let herself be vulnerable. But now, with Cheyenne beside her, with her children nestled safely under the furs, she realized that maybe she had been wrong. Maybe there was more to life than fear. Maybe there was room for hope. As the night wore on, she found herself leaning closer to him, drawn by the quiet strength that emanated from him, by the soft, unspoken promise in his gaze. And when he looked at her, really looked at her, there was no pity in his eyes, only understanding, only acceptance. Days turned into weeks, and with each passing day, Hannah found herself growing stronger. She learned to trust Cheyenne in ways she never thought possible. She watched him care for her children with a tenderness she hadn't expected, and in return, she found herself opening up to him, piece by piece. The wall she had built around her heart slowly began to crumble, not all at once, but in quiet, hesitant steps. One afternoon, as Cheyenne returned from a hunting trip, the sky heavy with the promise of another storm, Hannah was waiting for him by the fire. She had a question that had been sitting in her heart for days, and now, with the world quiet around them, it felt like the right moment. "You said I would find peace," she began, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her chest. "But what about you? What have you lost?" Cheyenne paused for a moment, looking at her with a gaze that seemed to reach deep inside her. His expression softened, and for the first time, he shared a piece of his past with her, of the tribe he had lost, of the family taken from him by the ravages of war and time. "I lost them," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of years. But I am not lost. Not anymore. Hannah's heart ached for him, for the quiet sorrow in his words. In that moment, she understood something profound. There was no end to loss, no finality to the pain. But there was redemption in moving forward. There was hope in the strength to rebuild, to love again. As the storm rolled in, they sat by the fire, the warmth of the flames and the warmth of each other's presence filling the silence between them. For the first time in a long while, Hannah allowed herself to believe in a future that could be different from the past, a future that might hold more than just survival. In Cheyenne's quiet strength, in his unwavering patience, she found something she had not thought possible, a chance at redemption. And with it,